June 15, 1943. The SS America cut through the choppy Atlantic waters, its engines thrumming in the distance. For the 423 German prisoners of war on board, the journey from Casablanca to New York Harbor marked the beginning of an unimaginable chapter. Among them stood Klaus Vivber, a 28-year-old officer who had fought in the deserts of North Africa. Now, after the fall of the Afrika Korps, he found himself a prisoner, his life now bound to the whims of a war he had once believed was his to win. Klaus pressed his face against the small porthole, his breath fogging up the thick glass. The excitement in the air was palpable, and despite the shame he still carried from the defeat, his curiosity began to rise as the ship sailed closer to its destination. The Atlantic air, cool and salty, seemed to promise something unknown. The 2 weeks spent cramped in the bowels of the ship had been filled with endless conversations among the prisoners, most of whom were consumed by fear, confusion, and, above all, uncertainty about what awaited them in America. The men had been taken during the collapse of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia. The massive Allied offensive, which had eventually pushed Rommel's forces from North Africa, had overwhelmed them. Klaus's battalion, once proud and strong, had been decimated. The defeat still stung, but as the ship approached New York Harbor, the land that they had been taught to view as an enemy, a strange new emotion began to emerge in Klaus: curiosity. He had been told of the Americans in whispers and rumors, propaganda that painted them as weak and disorganized, a nation struggling under its own internal conflicts. But now, as the Statue of Liberty loomed on the horizon, Klaus began to question everything he had ever been taught about this enemy nation. The prisoners had been separated from their guards during the voyage, kept below deck in the hold of the ship. They had heard little from their captors except for the occasional orders and the distant echoes of American soldiers laughing. The discipline they had maintained through the hardship of transport was tested every day as the uncertainty grew. Some of the men speculated, wildly, about the camp they would be taken to, about the food they would receive, and above all, the question that had plagued their minds since they were captured: how would the Americans treat them? Many of the men expected brutality. They had been told by their commanders that American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, and weak. The reality, as it turned out, was far different. Sergeant William Thompson, one of the American MPs aboard the ship, had been a farm boy from Ohio. He didn't carry the same animosity towards his prisoners that many others might have. He followed the Geneva Convention meticulously, offering the prisoners their basic needs: decent meals, medical care, and proper treatment. It was something none of the prisoners could understand at first. As the SS America sailed toward New York, the prisoners were anxious and tense, trying to prepare for whatever lay ahead. Klaus held on to his small leather journal, the only possession he had managed to keep through the chaos of capture. His university education in engineering had taught him the importance of observation and documentation. He planned to write down every detail of this strange new world they were entering. Even as a prisoner, Klaus knew he was experiencing something unlike anything he had anticipated. The war had taken him across Europe, from Poland to France, and then to North Africa. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to experience. He had marched as a conqueror across Europe, but now, as he looked out at the American coastline, he found himself wondering if he was about to experience something far different, perhaps even a world where he was not the enemy. The ship continued its journey, cutting through the waters with a steady, determined rhythm as Klaus and his fellow prisoners prepared to disembark and face a world they could not yet comprehend. What awaited them in America would challenge everything they thought they knew. June 21st, 1943. The SS America slowed as it approached the bustling harbor of New York City, its engines humming in sync with the rising anticipation below deck. For the 423 German prisoners on board, the ship's arrival was not just a moment in time, it was a threshold between worlds. As the gangplanks were lowered and the prisoners were ordered topside, a flood of emotions coursed through Klaus Vibert and his fellow captives. They had crossed the ocean, their fate sealed by the conflict in North Africa, but now they were about to encounter the land they had been told to fear. As the prisoners emerged from the cramped confines of the ship's hold, The bright Atlantic sunlight struck them like a physical force. Klaus blinked, adjusting to the harsh light as he stood on deck, gazing at the towering skyline of Manhattan in the distance. His heart raced with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The rumors about America, the country that had been painted as a decadent, chaotic land in their Nazi propaganda, seemed a lifetime away from the reality he now faced. Standing near the bow of the ship, Klaus could see the massive Statue of Liberty rising majestically from the waters, her torch gleaming brightly against the backdrop of a clear blue sky. The sight was breathtaking, and for a moment, the air around him seemed to thicken with the weight of history. This was the symbol of freedom that they had been taught to despise, a symbol now casting its long shadow over the German prisoners in a way they had not expected. "Mein Gott," whispered Oberoffizier Friedrich Steinbach, his voice full of wonder. The 19-year-old soldier from the Rhineland had never been farther than 50 kilometers from his home before the war, and now he stood on the deck of a foreign ship, gazing at the Statue of Liberty in silent disbelief. Klaus could feel the weight of the moment, and as he looked around at his fellow prisoners, he saw the same mix of emotions reflected in their faces: awe, confusion, and, most surprisingly, respect. The men around him, many of whom had fought bitterly against the Allies, were silent. The noise of the bustling harbor seemed to fade into the background as the prisoners took in the sights. For Klaus, this moment was a turning point. He had been taught to believe that America was a broken, chaotic society, a land of racial strife, economic turmoil, and weakness. But what he saw before him was something different. The New York skyline, with its imposing skyscrapers, symbolized strength and prosperity. The port, filled with activity, seemed to hum with a vibrant energy he had never associated with America. Among the prisoners, there was an unspoken realization that this America, this land they had been told to hate, was not what they had imagined. It was more complex, more powerful, and far more organized than they had ever been led to believe. As the ship docked, the prisoners were herded off the gangplanks and onto the docks. Klaus's eyes flicked from the American soldiers standing at attention, their uniforms immaculate and well-maintained, to the workers unloading cargo. He noticed something that he had never expected to see: men and women of all races working together in harmony, their movements efficient and coordinated, creating a stark contrast to the racial divisions that had been central to Nazi ideology. Among the guards, Klaus saw a woman in military uniform, directing traffic with the same authority and purpose as her male counterparts. It was a sight that defied everything he had been taught about women's roles in society. According to Nazi propaganda, American women were weak and unimportant, but here was a woman commanding respect and executing her duties without hesitation. Klaus could feel a growing sense of discomfort. His worldview, one built on the foundation of Nazi beliefs, was being tested. The America he saw was different from what he had imagined, and the ideological framework that had shaped his life seemed to be crumbling, bit by bit. As the prisoners were loaded onto transport trucks for the journey inland, Klaus continued to observe the city around him. He noticed the way American civilians moved through the streets, going about their daily business, with the ease of a society at peace. There were no signs of the chaos he had been led to believe America was experiencing. No, what Klaus saw was a thriving, dynamic society, one that was operating smoothly despite the war raging on the other side of the globe. The trucks began their journey through the city, and Klaus could catch glimpses of the bustling streets through the canvas covers. The soldiers were still professional, but now they seemed more like ordinary men, not the ruthless, uncaring captors that Klaus had expected. They were friendly, polite, and, most unsettlingly, human. The reality of the situation began to sink in. He was no longer in the world he had known. He was not in enemy territory. Instead, Klaus Weber was in a land that was completely unfamiliar, a land where the rules of the game had changed. For the first time since his capture, Klaus began to wonder if his entire understanding of the world, his understanding of good and evil, of right and wrong, was about to be rewritten. June 22nd, 1943. The prisoners had barely absorbed the stunning sights of New York when the reality of their situation began to sink in again. The trucks rattled along the city streets, passing towering buildings, bustling intersections, and wide avenues that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Klaus Wibber looked out from the back of the truck, trying to take it all in. The city, this vast modern metropolis, was a far cry from the war-torn Europe he had known. As the trucks finally left the urban sprawl behind, heading westward, Klaus felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were being transported to another world entirely. The prisoners were herded onto a specially configured train at Grand Central Terminal. Klaus, along with the other men, had expected to be crammed into cattle cars, just as they had seen in the films and read about in German propaganda. Instead, they found themselves in converted passenger coaches, well lit, clean, and surprisingly comfortable. It was a small detail, but to Klaus and his fellow captives, it was another blow to the image they had long held of the enemy. As the train began its journey, Klaus watched out the window, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The landscape that unfolded before him was unlike anything he had imagined. The rolling hills of the American countryside were dotted with farms and small towns, each one more prosperous and modern than the rural villages he had left behind in Germany. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of American industrial might, factories, refineries, and manufacturing plants that appeared to be operating at full capacity. The prisoners were still under the watchful eye of the American guards, but something about the atmosphere of the journey felt different. The guards were polite, almost conversational. Sergeant Robert Murphy, a young Irish-American from Chicago, had been assigned to the prisoner's car. He seemed to take a particular interest in Klaus, offering cigarettes and asking questions about life in Germany. Klaus, who had always been taught to view the enemy as faceless, dehumanized soldiers, found himself stunned by Murphy's casual friendliness. "You boys fought hard in Africa," Murphy said, his voice low but friendly. "My cousin Jimmy was at Kasserine Pass. He said you fellas gave them quite a fight." Klaus was taken aback. He had never expected to hear such recognition from an enemy soldier. To him, the Americans had always been portrayed as unworthy opponents, their victories chalked up to luck or overwhelming numbers. But here, on this train, Murphy's words had the ring of genuine respect. This encounter marked the beginning of a shift in Klaus's perception of the Americans. He had always viewed them through the lens of propaganda, taught to see them as inferior, both in terms of military prowess and national unity. But now, sitting across from Murphy, who spoke with the familiarity of a soldier, Klaus was forced to reconsider the narrative he had grown up with. As the train rolled on, Klaus observed more details that further challenged his expectations. The train passed through small towns and rural landscapes, each one seemingly untouched by the chaos of war. Children played in the streets, and farmers worked the fields with modern machinery that Klaus had never seen in Europe. He watched as American families went about their daily lives, their faces full of hope and determination. "This is what they told us to fear," Klaus thought to himself, his grip tightening around his leather journal. The prisoners' conversation with their guards became increasingly relaxed. They shared stories of life before the war, of families, of hometowns, of jobs they had once held. For Klaus, the realization that his captors were not so different from himself began to settle in. They were men who had fought for their country, yes, but they were also fathers, sons, and brothers, much like the men he had left behind in Germany. The train continued. Westward, passing through vast stretches of farmland and industrial hubs, Klaus had learned to read between the lines during his years in the army, and what he saw here spoke volumes about the strength of the American war effort. The factories he passed were operating at full throttle, churning out weapons and supplies that would eventually turn the tide of the war. The American military machine was larger, more efficient, and better equipped than anything he had imagined. It was a reminder that the propaganda he had swallowed for so long was not just misguided, it was wrong. By the time the train reached its first major stop, Klaus was beginning to experience a shift in his thinking that would only deepen as the days went on. The cold, harsh image of America that he had carried with him for so long was starting to melt away, replaced by the reality of a country that was strong and most surprisingly compassionate. The men who had once been his enemies were now beginning to feel like his equals. As the train rumbled on through the night, Klaus's thoughts drifted to his family back home. The letters he had received from his sister Greta in Munich had been carefully worded, but they conveyed a picture of a Germany that was increasingly shattered by air raids, food shortages, and social unrest. The contrast between the life she described and the prosperity he saw through the train window only served to deepen his confusion. How could his homeland, once proud and mighty, have fallen so far behind in the struggle against America? As the journey continued, Klaus began to see the cracks in the world he had known. The more he witnessed of the American way of life, the more his own beliefs about his country and the war began to erode. There was still much he did not understand about the country he was being held captive in, but one thing was becoming clear. The war had not been what he had been told it was, and America, his enemy, was not what he had been led to believe. June 25th, 1943. The train finally slowed as it entered Colorado, winding its way toward the majestic Rocky Mountains. Klaus VB sat silently by the window, his mind awash with the memories of the journey. What had once seemed like a nightmare, a transport filled with uncertainty, had become something altogether different. What had begun with fear and distrust now gave way to an uncomfortable curiosity, as the train wound its way into a future that Klaus had never imagined. As the prisoners disembarked from the train at Camp Carson, the first thing Klaus noticed was the air. It was fresh, clean, and invigorating. The dry mountain breeze was a stark contrast to the humid, oppressive atmosphere of the Atlantic crossing, and it carried with it the scent of pine trees and wildflowers. The camp sprawled across the high plains, its rows of barracks and administration buildings stretching toward the foothills of the Rockies, each one meticulously constructed and well maintained. Colonel William Bradford, the camp commander, greeted the prisoners with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. His military background had prepared him for moments like this. Klaus had expected to find harshness in the faces of his captors, the cold, distant expressions of men who saw only enemies before them. But what he saw in Bradford was something else, a pragmatism born of experience, tempered by the understanding that prisoners of war were not just prisoners, but human beings. The first surprise came when the prisoners were escorted to their barracks. Klaus had expected them to be crude, overcrowded, and uncomfortable, something reminiscent of the labor camps he had heard about in Soviet Russia. But what he found instead were neat, well-constructed buildings. Each barrack was equipped with adequate heating and ventilation, and though the furnishings were simple, they were clean and functional. Inside, the prisoners were given the chance to settle in, and Klaus couldn't help but notice how different this. Camp was from the images he had been fed. The food was the next shock. As the prisoners sat down for their first meal at Camp Carson, Klaus's eyes widened. He had expected to be given only the barest rations, dry bread, some gruel, perhaps a small portion of meat if they were lucky. But what was served to them was something far beyond that: roast beef, fresh vegetables, bread, and even a dessert of pie. The portions were generous, and it seemed almost wasteful compared to the meager meals Klaus and his fellow soldiers had grown accustomed to during the war. "This is ridiculous," Klaus muttered to himself, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. This is not what we were told America was like. As the days passed, Klaus began to see that this camp, this place that was supposed to be his captivity, was not the hell he had imagined. The medical facilities were another surprise. The camp had modern equipment, and the prisoners were treated with respect. They were allowed regular checkups and medical treatment that went beyond the bare minimum required by the Geneva Convention. Klaus, a trained engineer, was especially struck by the cleanliness and organization of the camp. It seemed that every detail had been carefully thought through, from the layout of the barracks to the structure of the work programs offered to the prisoners for the first time in weeks. Klaus felt something that had been missing since his capture, a sense of stability. The world outside of Camp Carson was still at war, but inside the camp, the routine was predictable. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of battlefields and the uncertainty that had marked his life as a soldier. He found it both strange and calming. The American soldiers assigned to the camp were professional, courteous, and most surprisingly, friendly. Staff Sergeant William Thompson, who had been assigned to oversee the prisoners' quarters, proved to be a case in point. The Nebraska native was a man who had grown up on a farm, and his down-to-earth manner immediately put the German prisoners at ease. Rather than adopting the cold, detached attitude of many military personnel, Thompson spoke with the prisoners, engaging in conversations about farming, the weather, and even family life. Klaus had never thought he would find common ground with an American soldier, yet here he was, speaking to Thompson as if they were two men from the same world. Their conversations, which started as mere pleasantries, soon deepened. Thompson spoke about his own experiences, his family's farm back in Nebraska, the struggles of rural life during the war, and his thoughts on the conflict. "You know," Thompson said one evening as he sat with Klaus, "a lot of folks back home don't really know what's going on in the war. They see the big news stories, but they don't get the personal side of it. They don't know what it's like to be out here, living it day by day. I guess that's why we're here. Just doing what we can, right?" Klaus nodded, struck by the simplicity of Thompson's words. It was something he had never really thought about, how distant the war must seem to the civilians who lived far from the front lines. He had been so consumed by his role in the conflict, so blinded by the rhetoric of war that he had failed to see the bigger picture. But as the days turned into weeks, Klaus began to see that the Americans were not the monsters they had been portrayed as. They were just people, soldiers doing their duty, but also men with families, hopes and dreams. He found himself questioning the very ideology that had led him to this place, the very beliefs that had justified the war. As his days at Camp Carson went on, Klaus's perceptions of the enemy began to change. The Germans he had fought beside, the men who had once been his comrades, were now in many ways his equals. They too had been caught in the machinery of war, victims of the same propaganda that had shaped his own views. The transformation was not instantaneous, and it was not easy. But with every conversation, every meal, every day spent in the camp, Klaus felt his mind beginning to open. He started to see America not as the enemy, but as a nation full of people, each with their own story, their own struggles, and their own hopes for the future. And perhaps, just perhaps, that future could be different for him as well. July 10th, 1943. The routine at Camp Carson had settled into a rhythm for Klaus Weber and his fellow prisoners. Days were filled with work programs, educational opportunities, and quiet moments of reflection. Klaus, still adjusting to his new reality, had become more involved in the camp's activities. He had joined the engineering corps, where his skills were put to use in assisting with the construction of new barracks and facilities. In the evenings, he would meet with fellow prisoners to discuss their new surroundings, to compare their experiences, and to talk about their homes in Germany, what they remembered and what had been lost. It was during one of these evening discussions that Klaus found himself beginning to question everything he had believed about the world. He had arrived at Camp Carson as a prisoner of war, but the more he experienced, the more he realized that his captivity was transforming him in ways he had never anticipated. The American guards continued to treat the prisoners with respect, adhering to the principles of the Geneva Convention while offering their charges, basic comforts that far exceeded what the Germans had been led to expect. The food was plentiful, the work assignments were respectful, and most surprising of all, the Americans treated them as human beings. It was not just the physical treatment that shocked Klaus, it was the psychological shift that began to take root. He had always been taught that the American way of life was decadent, that it was a nation of chaos and weakness. But in the months since his capture, Klaus had begun to see a different side of America. He saw an industrious, diverse society, one that was not the fractured, broken land that Nazi propaganda had depicted. One of the most significant experiences for Klaus came when he began to interact more with the American soldiers and civilians who were stationed at Camp Carson. Sergeant Robert Murphy, who had been one of the first American soldiers to speak with. Klaus, on the train journey west, continued to strike up conversations with him. But it was not just Murphy. Other soldiers, too, had begun to take an interest in the German prisoners, recognizing them not as enemies, but as men caught in the machinery of war. One day, during a lunch break, Klaus found himself talking with Corporal Eddie Kowalski, an American soldier from Detroit. Kowalski had a Polish-American background, and he spoke openly about his family's immigrant story. "My grandparents came over from Poland back in the early 1900s, Kowalski explained as he ate his meal. They worked in the factories, built a life from the ground up. Hell, they didn't even speak English when they arrived. They were poor as hell, but they made it. That's the American dream." Klaus listened intently. He had heard of the American dream, but had never understood it. The notion that someone could rise from poverty to success through hard work had seemed like a myth to him, a lie designed to distract the working class from their true struggles. But here, across the table from Kowalski, the dream suddenly felt tangible. "You ever think about what your life might have been like back in Poland?" Klaus asked, genuinely curious. Kowalski smiled wryly. "Sure, I could have stayed there, but I wouldn't have the life I have now. The opportunities here are like nothing you could imagine. You can be anything you want if you work hard enough." Klaus felt a sense of discomfort, something akin to guilt as Kowalski spoke. He had been trained to view America as a land of exploitation and decay, yet here was an American soldier, one of the enemy, who seemed to embody the very values that the Nazi regime had rejected. In that moment, Klaus began to question not only his understanding of America, but also the ideals that had shaped his life until now. It wasn't just the conversations that were changing Klaus's perception, it was the very atmosphere of Camp Carson. The camp was a microcosm of the diversity and cooperation that seemed to define America. Prisoners, soldiers, and civilians from various backgrounds worked side by side, sharing meals, engaging in friendly conversations, and learning from one another. In the evenings, when the workday was over, the prisoners would often gather for informal lessons on English, history, and other subjects, helping to bridge the cultural divide that had separated them from their captors. Klaus himself had taken to reading American literature, eager to understand more about the country he was now a part of, even if only temporarily. One evening, Klaus found himself sitting with Sergeant Thompson, who had been an unlikely but constant source of conversation. They sat together on a bench in the camp, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Thompson was sharing stories about his life back in Nebraska, about his family's farm, and the simplicity of rural life. Klaus couldn't help but admire the way Thompson spoke about his country. He spoke with pride, but also with a humility that seemed at odds with the image Klaus had been given of Americans. "This country," Thompson said thoughtfully, "it's big, it's messy, and it's full of problems, but we try to do right by each other. That's what makes America great." Klaus nodded slowly, taking in the words. He had never heard an American soldier speak so candidly about his country. It was the opposite of what he had been told. In the German military, America was portrayed as a land of disorder, a place where individuals were selfish and divided. But what Klaus was beginning to see at Camp Carson was that this disorder was what gave Americans their strength. Their ability to accept and even embrace differences, to find unity in their diversity, was something Klaus had never been exposed to before. The more Klaus interacted with the Americans, the more his world began to shift. He found himself questioning the very fabric of the ideology that had guided him through the war. The values of democracy, freedom, and cooperation that the Americans held dear were becoming impossible for him to dismiss. It was a slow process, but Klaus could feel his understanding of the world changing. One afternoon, a group of civilian volunteers from Colorado Springs arrived at Camp Carson to visit the prisoners. They brought books, games, and other recreational materials, and they spent the afternoon talking with the men, asking about their lives and their experiences. The volunteers represented a cross-section of American society, farmers, teachers, businessmen, and religious leaders, all of whom were united by a sense of duty to help those in need, even if those people had once been their enemies. For the first time since his capture, Klaus found himself engaged in conversations with Americans who didn't see him as a prisoner or an enemy, but simply as a person. The kindness and open-mindedness they displayed were things Klaus had never expected from the country he had once fought against. The encounter with the civilians would go on to challenge his deepest assumptions about what it meant to be an enemy and what it meant to be human. December 24th, 1943. The high plains of Colorado were blanketed in snow as Christmas approached, and for the first time in many months, the prisoners of Camp Carson found themselves experiencing something that had once seemed impossible, a sense of peace. The war, which had defined their lives for so long, now felt distant, as the prisoners faced a new reality in the midst of their captivity. For Klaus Weber, Christmas 1943 marked a turning point. The camp, usually cold and utilitarian, was transformed into something almost magical. The American personnel, along with the German prisoners, had worked together to decorate the camp, creating a festive atmosphere that transcended national boundaries. Klaus watched as fellow prisoners, men who had once been his comrades in arms, took part in the preparations. Some carved wooden figurines, while others strung up decorations on the barracks. The scene was surreal, like something from another world. The spirit of Christmas was infectious. As the camp's main hall filled with the smells of roasting meat and baking bread, Klaus felt a strange warmth that had little to do with the fires burning in the mess hall. The decorations, the festive music, and the sight of men who had once been soldiers, now working together for something as simple as a holiday feast, filled him with a sense of humility he had not expected. As evening descended, Klaus found himself standing beside Sergeant Bill Thompson, watching the prisoners and the American soldiers come together in quiet camaraderie. It was a stark contrast to the cold, disciplined world they had known in the war. The guards, once distant figures in uniform, now seemed more like men sharing in the same human experience. They laughed, joked, and even shared stories of their own families, creating bonds with the prisoners that would have been unimaginable just months before. Klaus's own thoughts turned to his family back in Germany. The letter he had received from his sister Greta just days earlier had been a bittersweet reminder of the devastation that had befallen his homeland. The air raids, the shortages, the constant fear. They were worlds apart from the warmth and abundance he now experienced. As he sat at the dinner table with fellow prisoners, Klaus found it hard to reconcile the reality of his own captivity with the suffering of his family back home. How could he justify the comfort he had found in this American camp when so many of his countrymen were living in misery? But as he glanced around the room, he realized that this was exactly what the Christmas celebration was about. It was about hope, about human connection, and about finding a sense of shared humanity even in the darkest of times. Klaus had come to Camp Carson as an enemy, a soldier sworn to fight for a cause he believed was right. But now, sitting at that table, surrounded by men who had once been his foes, he felt something he had not expected, a deep sense of gratitude. The meal that night was a feast unlike anything Klaus had ever experienced. Roast turkey, ham, fresh vegetables and pies filled the long tables. It was a spread that would have been impossible to provide in wartime Germany, where rationing had stripped away even the most basic comforts. But here, in the heart of America, Klaus tasted abundance for the first time in months, and the contrast with the grim reality of his home was stark. As they ate, Klaus found himself talking to Corporal Tony Castellano, who had joined the American military from a family of Italian immigrants. They spoke about life in America, about the family farms, the prosperity, and the opportunities that seemed so far removed from the struggles Klaus had known in Germany. Castellano spoke with pride about his family's success in America, about the way his grandparents had built a life from nothing. For Klaus, it was a revelation. "You know, it's strange," Castellano said between bites of food. "My grandparents came here with nothing. No money, no connections, but they worked hard, and now look at us. We have a good life, a real life." Klaus had always seen Americans as soft, undisciplined people, but Castellano's words made him question that assumption. The American dream, the myth of prosperity through hard work, was something Klaus had once dismissed. But now, sitting across from Castellano, it seemed real, alive and tangible in a way that he could no longer ignore. After the meal, the prisoners participated in a Christmas service led by both American and German chaplains. Klaus, though not a religious man, found himself moved by the unity that the service symbolized. Men of different faiths, different nationalities, and different beliefs stood together, singing hymns and praying for peace. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about the American spirit, one of unity, generosity, and hope, even in the face of conflict. Klaus felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude as he listened to the prayers for peace. He had once been taught to view the world in terms of enemies and allies, of winners and losers. But in that moment, surrounded by prisoners and soldiers alike, he began to see the possibility of a different world, a world where nations could coexist, where former enemies could share in the human experience without the baggage of ideology or hate. The evening's festivities continued with music and laughter, and Klaus found himself participating in a group performance. Several of the prisoners joined together with their American counterparts, singing both German and American Christmas carols. It was a simple act, but it was one that symbolized the change Klaus was beginning to feel inside. For the first time, the walls that had once separated him from the American soldiers began to crumble. As the night drew to a close, Klaus sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the journey he had made since his capture. From the shame of defeat in North Africa to the discomfort of captivity, he had come a long way. But this night, this Christmas, was the moment when everything began to change. It was no longer just about survival or duty, it was about understanding, empathy, and the possibility of a future beyond the war. Klaus looked out at the stars above, his heart filled with a sense of peace he had not thought possible. He had started this journey as a soldier of the Reich, convinced of his superiority and the righteousness of his cause. But now, sitting in an American camp, surrounded by men who had once been his enemies, he realized that the war had not just changed the world, it had changed him. May 8th, 1945. The announcement came without fanfare. Klaus Weber was working on a construction project at Camp Carson, helping to build additional barracks to accommodate the growing number of prisoners, when the news reached him. It was just a simple statement from Captain Frank Morrison, his supervisor: "The war is over. Germany has surrendered." The words felt surreal. Klaus had expected something more dramatic, perhaps an official ceremony or a great celebration among the guards and prisoners alike. But instead, it was as if the war had quietly ended while they were all preoccupied with the everyday routines of camp life. Klaus stood still for a moment, taking in the news, processing its significance. The realization was slow to settle in, but as it did, a sense of relief washed over him. Klaus had been a soldier for years, trained to fight, to endure, to never show weakness. But now, with the war officially over, Klaus found himself adrift, unsure of what to do with his life. The war had consumed him for so long that he had never considered what would happen when it ended. He had fought with the conviction that Germany would triumph, that the war was righteous, that victory was inevitable. Now, all of that had crumbled with the announcement of surrender. As Klaus reflected on the news, he couldn't help but think of the journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to America as a prisoner, humiliated and defeated, but over the months he had experienced a profound transformation, one that had shattered the foundations of everything he had believed in. America, the country he had once viewed with disdain, had shown him a side of humanity that Nazi ideology had denied. He had witnessed kindness, generosity, and even respect from the very people he had once been taught to hate. Klaus looked around the camp, observing the other prisoners. Some of the men were quiet, reflective, while others exchanged glances of disbelief. For many of them, the surrender of Germany marked not just the end of the war, but the end of a way of life. They had been soldiers in a cause they believed in, and now they were left with the question of what came next. For Klaus, the question was even more pressing. What had the war really been about? What had he fought for, and what had it all meant? He had been raised to believe in the superiority of the German people, in the righteousness of the Nazi cause. But now, in the wake of Germany's surrender, those beliefs seemed hollow. The ideology he had once followed with unwavering faith had led him to this, captivity in a foreign land, surrounded by men who had once been his enemies, yet now treated him with dignity. The psychological transformation Klaus had undergone during his captivity was profound. But the surrender of Germany forced him to confront it in a new way. As the war ended, Klaus found himself questioning everything he had been taught, everything he had believed in. The ideological foundation that had supported him for so long had cracked, and now he was left to rebuild his understanding of the world from the ground up. At Camp Carson, the mood was subdued. The American soldiers, who had spent years fighting overseas, didn't celebrate the end of the war with the same enthusiasm as one might expect. For them, it was not a time for victory dances or parades. It was a time for reflection. Many of the American personnel had lost friends and family in the conflict, and they too had been forever changed by the brutality of war. Klaus felt a strange sense of camaraderie with these men. They had been adversaries on the battlefield, but now they shared something deeper, a mutual understanding of the war's toll. The American soldiers, who had once seemed like a distant and impersonal force, now seemed more like men who had endured the same hardships. They had fought for their country, just as he had fought for his. But unlike Klaus, these men were not defined by their nationalism. They were shaped by something else, something that Klaus was only beginning to understand. As the days passed and the news of Germany's surrender spread through the camp, the German prisoners began to talk among themselves. Many of them had expected the end of the war to bring a sense of triumph, but instead it brought confusion. What would become of them now? What would happen to their families? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen to their beliefs? Klaus, who had spent so much of his life following orders, now found himself asking questions that he had never dared to ask before. He was no longer the same man who had boarded the SS America in June of 1943. The man who had arrived on American shores filled with shame and distrust was now someone else entirely. His journey had taken him from enemy soldier to something more, something that neither Germany nor the Allies had fully prepared him for in the days following the surrender. Klaus found himself speaking more with the American soldiers. Their conversations were no longer just about the war, they were about life, about the future, and about what it meant to rebuild after everything had been destroyed. Klaus found himself listening to the American soldiers with a newfound respect. These men had lived through the same horrors he had, and they were also beginning to look ahead, to imagine a world beyond the war. As the end of the war sank in, Klaus realized that the hardest part was not the fighting or the capture. It was the transformation that came after. It was the realization that everything he had believed, everything he had fought for was gone, and in its place, there was only a future that was uncertain, but also full of possibility. The war was over, and with it, the world he had known was gone. What would come next, Klaus did not know, but he was beginning to understand that the future was not shaped by the past, it was shaped by the choices people made. For the first time, Klaus felt a strange, quiet hope. Late 1945, the months following Germany's surrender had been a time of profound reflection for Klaus Verbeer and his fellow prisoners. The war was over, and their captors, once the embodiment of everything they had been taught to fear, had become, in many ways, their companions. As the war ended, the German prisoners at Camp Carson faced a new challenge: how to return to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they had known it. Klaus had changed in ways he never could have imagined when he first set foot on American soil. When he had arrived in the United States as a prisoner of war, he had been full of resentment, anger, and shame. He had believed in the superiority of his homeland and its cause. But now, after months of reflection, of conversations with American soldiers and civilians, and of exposure to a side of America he had never expected, Klaus had begun to see the world differently. The prisoners at Camp Carson had been exposed to the principles of democracy, the ideals of human dignity, and the strength that came from cooperation across racial, ethnic, and national boundaries. They had witnessed the American treatment of prisoners, humane, respectful, and grounded in the values of individual rights and justice. Klaus had been shocked to learn that his captors treated him and his fellow soldiers not as enemies, but as human beings deserving of respect. This treatment had made him question everything he had believed about the Nazi ideology and its claim to superiority. As the time for repatriation approached, Klaus found himself torn between the America he had come to respect and the Germany he had once called home. The letters from his sister Greta had painted a grim picture of life in post-war Germany, bombed-out cities, food shortages, and a country struggling to rebuild after the devastation. The reality of what he would return to was far from the prosperous, ordered world he had seen in America. Germany was a nation on its knees, struggling to rise from the ashes of its defeat. The prospect of returning to that devastated landscape was difficult for Klaus to reconcile with the life he had experienced in America. He had witnessed the generosity and strength of a country that had welcomed him as a prisoner, a country whose values had challenged everything he had been taught to believe. Now, as he prepared to return to Germany, he found himself questioning his place in that country and what role he could play in its future. For Klaus, the decision to return was not just about geography, it was about identity. The war had stripped him of his certainties and forced him to rebuild his understanding of the world. The man who had boarded the SS America in 1943 was no longer the same person who was preparing to return to Germany. He had undergone a transformation, one that could not be undone by simply crossing borders. As the days passed, Klaus found himself thinking more about his post-war future. The camp's work programs, which had initially seemed like a means of survival, had provided him with a new sense of purpose. He had worked alongside American engineers and technicians, learning new techniques and gaining skills that would be valuable in the reconstruction of his homeland. Klaus realized that the knowledge and experience he had gained in America could help him rebuild Germany, not just in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of ideas. He had witnessed firsthand the strength that came from democratic values, from cooperation between people of different backgrounds, and from the belief that all individuals deserved dignity and respect. Klaus's thoughts also turned to the relationships he had formed during his captivity, the friendships he had made with the American soldiers, the interactions with the civilians who had visited the camp, and the shared moments of humanity, all stood in stark contrast to the ideological battles that had once consumed him. Klaus had come to see the American people not as the enemy, but as a society that represented a vision of the future, one built on cooperation, democracy, and mutual respect. As the repatriation process began in late 1945, Klaus found himself reflecting on the choices he would soon have to make. Would he return to a Germany ravaged by war, a country that no longer seemed to embody the ideals he had once fought for, or would he stay in America, where he had experienced a different kind of life, one based on hope, resilience, and dignity? In the final days at Camp Carson, Klaus spent time with the American soldiers who had become his friends. Sergeant Thompson, who had shown him so much about the kindness of ordinary Americans, spoke with Klaus about the future. The conversation, while casual, seemed to carry the weight of a deeper understanding. "We'll be sending you guys back home soon," Thompson said one evening, his voice carrying a note of quiet sympathy. "But you've seen it yourself, what America is really like. And maybe you'll take something from that. Maybe you'll help rebuild Germany in a way that makes sense, in a way that's better than before." Klaus had never expected an American soldier to speak to him like that, so openly, so honestly. It was another example of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that transcended the boundaries of nationality and ideology. Klaus felt a sense of gratitude toward Thompson and the others who had shown him that there was more to America than the propaganda he had once believed. As Klaus packed his belongings, preparing for his departure from Camp Carson, he knew that he was leaving behind more than just a military camp. He was leaving behind a part of himself, the part that had been shaped by the war, by the lies of Nazi ideology, and by the beliefs that had guided him into battle. The man who would board the train to return to Germany was not the same man who had come to America in 1943. He was different. He was changed. The train ride back to the East Coast, where the prisoners would board ships bound for Europe, was a quiet one for Klaus. He sat by the window, watching the American landscape roll by, each mile carrying him farther from the country that had transformed his view of the world. As the train passed through small towns and open fields, Klaus reflected on everything he had seen and experienced during his captivity. The lessons learned, the friendships forged, and the ideological transformation that had taken place within him were now part of his story, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The train crossed into the eastern United States, and Klaus found himself looking ahead to a new future, one in which the lessons of America, the lessons of dignity, democracy, and humanity, would continue to shape his thoughts and actions. He had left Germany as a believer in Nazi ideology. He would return as something else entirely, a man who had seen firsthand what it meant to be truly free.